In the shadows of war, it is not always the generals or the battles that change the course of history. Sometimes, it is the quiet work of scientists in a basement laboratory. On February 14, 1942, in the bowels of Harvard University, Professor Louis Fieser lit a match. It was an experiment, a test of chemistry, in the service of a nation at war. The sample he ignited wasn't ordinary gasoline. It was mixed with thickening agents, a blend of aluminum salts, aluminum naphthenate, and aluminum palmitate. The result wasn't a flash or explosion. It was a slow, sticky burn. The gel clung to surfaces. It resisted water. It burned longer and hotter than anything else the military had seen. Fieser had not intended to invent a weapon, but the result was unmistakable. He had created a substance that could not be extinguished, a fire that would follow you, a flame that would become synonymous with terror. He recorded his notes methodically. The gel had the consistency of applesauce, thickening over time into something like rubber. Then he made the call, a call that would ignite a chapter of warfare more destructive than any that had come before it. The United States was, at that moment, deeply entrenched in a brutal war in the Pacific. The Japanese Imperial Army had shown an unwavering willingness to fight to the last man. They built defensive fortresses into the natural terrain, tunnels through volcanic rock, bunkers embedded in cliffs, and cave systems that stretched for miles. Traditional weapons had little effect. High explosives bounced off coral walls. Artillery fire collapsed only surface structures. Every yard gained by Allied troops came at enormous cost. At Iwo Jima, Marines would face more than 11 miles of underground fortifications. On Okinawa, tombs were turned into firing positions. Every hill, every ridge, every rock was a potential ambush. It was clear that something more than brute force was needed. A weapon was required that could reach deep into the earth and eliminate an enemy determined never to retreat. Enter napalm, a portmanteau of its chemical components. It was not designed for precision. It was designed for saturation, for denial, for incineration. What made napalm different wasn't just the heat it generated. It was its behavior. When ignited, it became a sticky, rolling wave of fire. It adhered to surfaces and, more horrifyingly, to skin. It crept into spaces where soldiers could not go. It could be sprayed, dropped, or launched. It flowed, burned, and suffocated. And it was terrifyingly effective. On July 4th, 1942, the first field test took place not on a battlefield, but on Harvard's soccer field. A shallow pool of water was prepared. 45 pounds of napalm compound was placed inside. Cambridge firefighters stood by. Nearby, tennis players continued their game. When the test began, the gel ignited and flared violently, throwing flaming globs into the air and across the water. The fire stuck to everything. It floated and burned on the surface of the water. The tennis players fled in panic. The fire department could do little. Water made it worse. This wasn't just a fuel. This was a weaponized flame. The military response was swift. The Chemical Warfare Service placed immediate orders. Dow Chemical ramped up production. A stable, transportable dry powder version of napalm was quickly developed. By mid-1943, the U.S. was producing 500,000 pounds per year. By 1944, production had reached 8 million. It became the heart of a new generation of incendiary bombs. The most infamous of these was the M69, a 6-pound cylinder filled with jelly gasoline. When dropped in clusters, 38 bombs at a time from a single casing, these devices would scatter over an area the size of a city block, splashing fire across everything in their path. The first combat use of napalm came in Europe, during the Allied invasion of Sicily. But in many ways, this was a warm-up. It was in the Pacific that napalm would find its true, horrific effectiveness. The island of Tinian marked its debut in that theater. Japanese forces had fortified the island extensively, digging into coral cliffs, constructing reverse slope positions immune to naval shelling, and embedding machine guns in concrete bunkers. Traditional bombing had failed. Artillery was ineffective. But when napalm bombs fell on Tinian, the results were devastating. Instead of explosions, waves of fire rolled across the fortifications. The gel crept into caves, through gun ports, into slits and cracks. Japanese soldiers who had survived weeks of bombardment emerged in flames. They ran screaming, their uniforms and skin on fire. Water from their canteens only made it worse. Dirt did nothing. Within days, Marines began requesting napalm strikes before every advance. Positions that had taken hours of fighting to secure could now be cleared in minutes. Tinian fell. Of the 9,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 4% survived. The U.S. military quickly realized napalm's power could be amplified even further. Portable flamethrowers had existed since World War I, but they were dangerous to operate. The men who carried them were massive targets, carrying 70 pounds of flammable gel on their backs. Casualty rates were astronomical. The Navy's CBs provided an answer, modifying Sherman tanks with high-pressure flamethrowers. These Zippo tanks could unleash streams of fire up to 150 yards while protecting their operators with armor plating. They were introduced on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, and the battlefield changed overnight. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams was among those wielding the M2 flamethrower. During the battle, he advanced alone, under fire, dragging his flamethrower across black volcanic ash toward a concrete pillbox. Artillery had failed. Grenades bounced off. Machine gun fire sparked off the tanks on his back. When he reached 10 yards, he pulled the trigger. A stream of flaming gel shot through the firing slit. Inside, temperature spiked beyond cremation levels. Metal warped. The machine gun melted. Williams moved to the next bunker. And the next. In a single afternoon, he cleared 7 positions with napalm. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. But even he would later say the real hero was the flame itself. But perhaps nowhere demonstrated napalm scale like the night of March 9th, 1945, Operation Meeting House. Over 330 B, 29 bombers flew from Guam toward Tokyo. Each aircraft carried a lethal load. 40 cluster bombs packed with over 1,500 M69 incendiary devices. The target, a densely packed residential area housing 750,000 civilians and thousands of small war-related workshops. Pathfinder aircraft dropped incendiaries in an X-shaped pattern to mark the target. Then came the flood. The bombers flew low, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, well below Japanese flak guns. Within minutes, individual fires merged into a single, uncontrollable firestorm. Ground temperatures exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds created by the superheated air reached hurricane force. They fed the fire and suffocated the shelters. Concrete boiled. Steel melted. The Sumida River turned to steam. When dawn broke, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been incinerated. Over 100,000 civilians were dead. More than Hiroshima. More than Nagasaki. 1 million people were left homeless in a single night. Japan's largest city, its heart, had been reduced to ash. The fire department was helpless. Napalm had melted their hoses, incinerated their trucks. In his final radio report, Captain Susumu Takahashi of the Tokyo Fire Department wrote, "The city is dying, and yet the campaign continued. March 11th, Nagoya burned. March 13th, Osaka. March 16th, Kobe. City after city fell under the flame. By July, 67 cities had been bombed. The damage was staggering. Rail networks collapsed. Food supply chains disintegrated. Factory workers refused to go to work. By the end of the campaign, 180 square miles of Japanese cities had been destroyed. Civilian casualties ranged from 300,000 to 500,000. Over 8 million people were left homeless. Okinawa was the final, horrifying application of napalm. The 713th Tank Battalion, converted entirely to flame tanks, landed with 54 Sherman variants equipped with high-capacity Ronson flamethrowers. They were backed by 250,000 gallons of thickened fuel. Every Marine rifle company now included napalm support teams. The Japanese had learned from Iwo Jima. They built fire breaks in tunnels, installed crude ventilation. They tried using wet cloth and mud as makeshift protection. It didn't work. Napalm flowed downhill. It flooded trenches. Barrels were rolled down slopes and ignited with phosphorus grenades. Hundreds of caves were cleared. In one instance, a cave sheltering 450 civilians refused to surrender. After warnings were given, a single stream of flame was fired into the opening. 5 minutes later, silence. Most had suffocated before the fire touched them. The flames consumed oxygen faster than they spread. In preparation for the invasion of mainland Japan, Operation Downfall, the United States planned to deploy 75 flame tank battalions. 5 million gallons of napalm were stockpiled. Every rifle company was to be trained in flamethrower use. The industrial capacity behind the napalm campaign rivaled that of the atomic program, and yet it would not be used. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, 2 bombs, 2 cities, 1 surrender. But even after the atomic bombings, napalm was dropped on Japanese cities, including a massive raid on Yada the night after Nagasaki. When the emperor surrendered, he mentioned a most cruel bomb. He meant the atom bomb. He did not mention napalm. But the statistics were undeniable. Napalm had destroyed more square miles. It had killed more civilians. It had erased more Japan's industrial capacity. A 1946 post-war survey concluded Japan would have surrendered by November 1945, even without the atomic bombs or Soviet invasion. Because of napalm, Louis Fieser returned to Harvard. He was honored quietly. He received the Medal for Merit, America's highest civilian award. But he grew uneasy. In 1967, during the Vietnam War, he watched footage of napalm falling on villages. He saw children running, engulfed in fire. He wrote to President Nixon, urging an international ban. When we developed napalm, he wrote, we never considered its use against people. His request was acknowledged but ignored. He died in 1977. His obituary celebrated his contributions to medicine, vitamin K, anti-malarial drugs. Napalm was never mentioned, but the legacy remained. In Tokyo,